Okay, good morning, and welcome to the very British weather that we have today. I hope you're all suitably sodden. I shall try to enliven you, or at least you might dry out by the end of the class. Today is basically a lecture about popular culture in the 19th century. But before I get going, I wanted to just explain where it fits in the class as a whole. The last few lectures, we've been exploring a sort of range of changes that occurred during the 19th century, and perhaps especially in the decades between the 1840s and the 1880s. And I've been suggesting to you that these changes have been caused by a variety of forces that I've characterized as broadly liberal, with a small l in their conception, and forces that transformed the practice of economic life, of representative politics, and of the nature of life for women and for the family. And in all those areas, there have been two things that I've been trying to emphasize. One is that they've caused the erosion of customary and local forms of social and economic organization, and put in their place, slowly and gradually, but put in their place a series of a sort of national or standardized forms that were deemed to be both more rational and more moral. Okay? The second point that I've been trying to draw out in these lectures is that these new forms of social and economic organization were intended to produce a new type of person, what I've described as a sort of ideal liberal subject, a new type of person. And what characterized that new person was having a sound moral character that enabled them to govern themselves and their families. So today we're basically going to look at a very similar process, but in the realm of popular culture, and we're going to look at the transition from the sort of customary culture that was predominantly local and unorganized to and ones that reformers characterized as irrational and immoral and disorderly, to forms of popular culture that were national in scope, that were increasingly commodified, i.e. made commercial, and took increasingly organized sort of bureaucratic or institutional forms. What I'm going to be suggesting to you today is that by 1914, by the outbreak of the First World War, we have something that looks recognizable to us, even in 21st century California, as a modern mass culture. A modern mass culture with three key characteristics: a clear division between work and leisure, a separation of the realms of work and leisure time, specific new spaces for the practice of leisure, and increasingly national and indeed imperial forms of popular culture. And we can think of that in terms of things like the cinema, but I'm going to talk to you mainly about organized sport. Now, of course, by this time in the class, you will have learned that these changes that I've been talking about across these series of areas were never linear. They never happened straightforwardly. And rather like electoral culture, popular culture was changed, but it also changed in ways that showed distinct forms of continuity from the earlier forms that were trying to be displaced by the new forms, and that they also created new types of traditions that we now think of as having existed for a long time, but in fact were a product of the second half of the 19th century. There are two important points that I want you to take out of this lecture and out of this account of the process of the transformation of popular culture. The first is that popular culture becomes less a space of active participation than one which is commercialized and becomes predicated around a new type of what I'm going to describe as a culture of spectatorship. So it's something that you watched, you observed, rather than something that you necessarily actively produced. The second point is that these new forms of popular culture dramatize the assumptions about how an individual was meant to conduct themselves. And basically what I'm going to be suggesting to you today is that popular culture created new disciplines of leisure. Having fun and pleasure was now not a straightforward thing. It came with a set of assumptions about how one should enjoy oneself. So, one big issue that we're going to be trying to work out today is how we get there. How do we get from this local, customary-based popular culture to one that looks recognizably modern? And I'm going to suggest that there are basically four key forces of reform leading to these changes. The first is the importance of moral reform, the promotion of new forms of moral and rational forms of recreation. And that's a continuation of the story that we began to see in the, with the evangelical revival in the 18th century. The second is the new work disciplines created by the consolidation of industrial capitalism, most notably the creation of a settled working day, working week, and working year, and the idea that leisure was now going to be something that helped recreate the worker. The third area is what I'm going to describe as the commodification of pleasure, the development of new commercial forms of mass entertainment that create this culture of spectatorship. And then finally, I'm going to be suggesting that a key influence upon these changes was imperialism and the impact of immigration, of the beginning of a more diverse form of popular culture reflected in leisure pursuits. So let me very quickly recap about the nature of customary culture that was to be displaced. And here I'm just going to gesture back very briefly to the lecture that I gave you on the Enlightenment and 18th century civil society, where you'll remember I used this image by Hogarth of a cockfight. And we talked about the ways in which moral reformers and Enlightenment scholars sought to understand this customary culture as both immoral and irrational. It was a double whammy. It was both immoral and irrational. And you saw this very clearly in your reading of John Brand's observations on popular antiquities in 1777, where you remember he tried to record the range of customary pursuits in Britain in order to be able to distinguish between those customs that should be continued and those which should be lost to history. So today your reading is from William Hone's Everyday book, published in 1825. And you'll see there's a slight difference in the tone between William Hone and John Brand. William Hone was a radical publisher. He was continually bankrupt, continually being pursued by the authorities. And his Everyday book sought to provide an almanac of the year organized around different customs on every day of the year. And as I told you on that lecture on the 18th century civil society, almanacs were a very, very popular and increasingly commercial genre that publishers used to as an income generator. Now, the key points that you need to remember about this customary culture is, as I said, that they're immoral and they're irrational, that they're seen to be based upon local forms of organization, local and oral forms of communication. They were traditions handed down orally in local communities. That they were seen to be collective and unruly, as in this Hogarth image, and that they were characterized by all the things that rational reformers and moral reformers thought were bad. That is, liberal supplies of alcohol, violence and cruelty, in this case cruelty to animals, and gambling. The other point that I didn't emphasize in the earlier lecture, that I'm just going to gesture to here because it becomes important later on, is that the other key feature of this customary culture is that it was predicated on there not being a clear separation between work and leisure. Okay? That there wasn't a clear pattern to the organization of the working day or the working week or indeed the working year. And these things were negotiated basically between workers and their masters, or in the case of household forms of production, between the family and the patriarch. All of this is going to look very different very soon. And one of the key reasons why that is the case is the continuing influence of moral reform and the development of new forms of rational recreation. Don't you love this image of the drunkard's coat of arms? Alcohol is a big theme of this lecture. If I was kind, I would have bought us in a keg of beer so that you could have enjoyed it in the proper spirit. What was that? It would? Well, maybe. Actually, I can't because most of you are under 21, and I would get into trouble. Yeah, if this could become a little pocket of the UK for the space of an hour and a half, I could freely supply you with alcohol. But alas, we're in Berkeley. Okay, so let's move to this, to the return to the world of the evangelical revival. Key part of what I'm going to be suggesting to you here is that the evangelical revival that sought to breathe new life, not just into the Anglican Church, but into religious practice generally in the 18th century, had a very long shadow in the 19th century. And one of the reasons, particularly in the Anglican community, was that many of the fears that Anglicans had in the 18th century continued to be evident in the 19th century. There was a continuing concern that the Anglican Church had lost its grip as the source of moral authority upon the growing and increasingly urban population. Indeed, in many ways, the understanding of secularization, of the emptying out of religion from the practice of social life, didn't just come from the Enlightenment. It didn't just come from the progression of enlightened rational thought, and it didn't just culminate in Darwin's victory of science over divinity in the middle of the 19th century. It came as much, I'm going to suggest, from the church and its dissenting critics, who were worried about the deeply irreligious nature of the working poor. So one of the things that they tried to do to try and spread the word of God to these seemingly irreligious people outside the influence of the church was to build new churches, to take the church into particularly the new urban spaces that had grown up so quickly in the late 18th and 19th centuries. So between 1770 and 1830, there were almost 49,000 new places of worship built. 49,000 new places of worship built in just 60 years. And most worryingly for the Anglican community, just 5% of those, a little under 2,300, were Anglican churches. So the vast majority of those were from the dissenting or nonconformist communities. We can think of this in terms of the spread of congregational chapels, Baptist chapels, Methodist chapels, etc. In fact, there were 3.5 times as many congregational chapels built as Anglican churches, 4 times more Baptist churches, and 14 times more Methodist chapels than Anglican churches. So the Anglicans, concerned about their receding grip upon the urban population, resolved to try and build new churches. And there was even a society called the Church Building Society, a rather unnovel name for its purpose, which successfully lobbied for 2 new church building acts in Parliament, first in 1818 and then in 1824. And these acts provided about £1.5 million for the construction of new churches. And there were 2,000 new Anglican churches built between 1831 and 1851. By 1918, there had been 4,000 new Anglican churches built. So this is an area of energetic attempts by religious communities to build new places of worship in the industrializing and urbanizing communities. In many ways, the worst fears of these communities were realized in the census of 1851, where there was a religious census held on the Sunday, which discovered, alarmingly for many contemporaries, that 60% of the population did not attend any place of worship on that Sunday. And even more concerning for the Anglican community, 50% of the people attending church were not Anglicans. And to confirm their worst fears, it was decisively shown that the majority of non-worship were the urban working class, the precise people over which the church sought to have a form of moral government. In fact, in the big cities like London, attendance fell as low as 20%, and that really didn't change for much of the 20th century. There's another survey conducted in 1902 that shows pretty much the same rates of non-attendance in London. And yet, religion continued to be a central fact of life for many people. And it did so in 3 ways. First was the influence of moral reform and the sort of practice of everyday life. Remember how the evangelical revival had sought to generalize the war against sin, to see sin that was everywhere and to remind everyone that they had to work hard on the salvation of their soul and the good forms of moral practice that would help save themselves. So moral reform, as we'll see in a moment, becomes very generalized. Secondly, religion becomes deeply politicized in the 19th century in new ways. You'll remember that the Test and Corporations Act had basically banned nonconformists, Catholics and nonconformists, from holding public office. That was finally repealed in 1829. You'll remember also that those nonconformists had to pay church rates for the maintenance of the local Anglican church, even though they were not members of those congregations. That was made voluntary in 1853, and finally abolished in 1868. It was a big part of nonconformist political agitation in the middle of the 19th century, trying to remove the burden of church rates. And finally, education provided an area in which religion became highly politicized, in part because of the creation of national education. State provided national education in 1870, where children, in 1870 and 1880, it was made compulsory for children to attend school for the first time. But also by opening up the ancient universities to non-Anglicans. The Universities Test Acts of 1871 finally opened up Oxford and Cambridge to non-Anglicans. Finally, religion remains important because even though people weren't frequently attending church, it remained the key way in which individuals marked the rites of passage of their life, of getting married, of being baptized, and of being buried. I mean, cremation does begin to develop in the 19th century, but the vast majority of people continue to be buried in churchyards. So up to 1914, 90% of marriages are conducted in places of worship, and so are 75% of baptisms. And indeed, there's some evidence to show that the peak attendance in places of worship was in 1904. So the peak attendance in terms of the numbers of people attending was in 1904, but you have to remember that the size of the population had grown so dramatically that doesn't work as a proportion of the population as a whole. So all of that is to slightly qualify the stereotypical account that basically religion is over by the time that Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species in 1859. It's certainly true that for much of the 18th and early 19th century, science and religion had been seen to be not mutually incompatible. Indeed, William Paley's Natural Theology in 1801 is a great example of that, where the scientific observation of nature showed for Paley that nature unfolded to God's divine plan. So that there wasn't necessarily an opposition coming out of the Enlightenment between religion and science. It's also the case that many people before Darwin began to think that nature actually had its own internal laws of development that could not be explained by forces of divine forces. And it's also the case that even after Darwin, many people try and combine the practice of science and religion. Okay? And in many ways, the best example of that is the proliferation of new forms of spiritualism in the late 19th century, where people try and do scientific experiments on human consciousness and the limits of the spirit. I want to just say a little more here about the ways in which moral and rational reform came to structure the understanding of personal life. And I'm going to do it through this figure that you see behind me of Samuel Smiles, the first guru of self-help, and a very un-Californian type of self-help guru he was, as you'll see. The point that I want to make here is that the question of moral government, of the moral government of one's behavior, exceeded the practice of religion. That moral reform became generalized and separated simply from the practice of religion. Indeed, in some ways, some historians have suggested that moral reform became a type of secular religion in the 19th century. A secular religion that championed this idea of moral character, of the individual developing sound forms of moral character. And a key part of the new types of popular culture we're going to be looking at in a moment was that these new forms of leisure were designed to promote sound moral character. They were meant to be both moral and rational in form, because leisure was increasingly linked to this idea of rational recreation, of recreation being about self-improvement and the development of strong and sound moral character. Now, you can see by the title of Smiles's books here, between 1859 and 1880, what sound moral character would look like. It wasn't a lot of fun. And his books basically charted the ways in which you could develop this sense of character through self-improvement and self-help. And a key thing that you should know immediately is that this was primarily a masculine endeavor. Smiles was primarily concerned with how men became respectable, moral, and rational. You have a reading from this week of Smiles's Self-Help, and I'm just going to remind you of the very first paragraph that you have to read, just because I think it's always instructive to learn from the great gurus of self-help. The object of the book, he writes briefly, is to reinculcate these old-fashioned but wholesome lessons, which perhaps cannot be too often urged, that youth must work in order to enjoy. Remember that. Youth must work in order to enjoy. That nothing creditable can be accomplished without application and diligence. That the student must not be daunted by difficulties, but conquer them by patience and perseverance. That above all, he must seek elevation of character, without which capacity is worthless and worldly success is naught. If the author has not succeeded in illustrating these lessons, he can only say that he has failed in his object. Now, the key part of Samuel's ideas of Smiles's ideas of self-help and self-improvement is that it required inculcating new habits of personal development, new habits, new practices of self-realization and recreation, recreating oneself. That was the point of leisure, to recreate oneself in more moral and rational ways. And while Smiles was not the architect of any of these developments, I want to simply make this point by showing you some images of the new forms of moral and rational recreation that were championed. So you see here a nice contrast between, does anyone know what this is? Anyone know what these two images are? Really? Really? Very good. A disorderly pub on the left. Melody, are you going to have a guess on the other one? Yeah. The other one is the perfect order and sobriety of a temperance meeting. Okay? So here you have a very nice contrast between the pub, which, as you can see, well, you can't, shall I turn the light off and you'll see it maybe more clearly? Between a pub where there is a promiscuous mix of women, children, and animals behaving in a variety of dissolute ways, as you can see, as opposed to the perfect order and respectability of a temperance meeting where everyone is dutifully and diligently seated. One of the key things about temperance meetings that was very important was they built their own halls in order to get people out of pubs. And right at the centerpiece of every temperance meeting was the symbolic signing of the pledge, where people pledged themselves to sobriety for the first time and casted away their immoral and dissolute ways. In many ways, this signing of the pledge, which you did up on this type of stage in front of the assembled audience, was rather like the evangelical conversion of being born again. And it comes directly out of that type of evangelical culture, this idea that you could be born again through signing the pledge. Here we have one of the key organizations of rational recreation that was the Mechanics' Institute. Institutes built for mechanics where they could go and read, where they could go and advance their education. They would go and see plays. There would be all sorts of reading matters. There would be meetings on specific issues and so forth. This is an image of the Mechanics' Institute in Manchester, which was built in 1854. And reading is a very important part, clearly, of the propagation of rational forms of recreation. Okay, now remember, this was also true of the evangelical revival, that the Sunday schools that proliferated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were in many ways about teaching working class children how to read so they could have a more intimate knowledge of the Bible, that many evangelical missionary societies were about propagating useful knowledge and disseminating copies of the Bible, both in Britain and its empire. But there were a series of forms of legislation in the 1840s and 1850s that tried to consolidate this new rational and literate culture. From the introduction of the penny post, where people could write letters to each other for the cost of a single penny, and that would enable the letter to be carried anywhere across the United Kingdom, to the opening of museums and public libraries enabled by the Museums Act of 1845 and the Public Library Act of 1850. In fact, there's a series of public libraries. There's the first one in 1850, where cities with a population of 10,000 could get a library, a free public library, if 2/3 of the ratepayers, like the property taxpayers in that locality, voted to have one. Although there are a bunch of other acts there's another one in 1866, it wasn't until 1919 that those restrictions were removed and that localities could build libraries regardless of a vote by the ratepayers or the size of their population. By 1900, there were 295 free public libraries across the country. The other key development here was the repeal of the Stamp Acts. The Stamp Acts that the radicals had called in the early 19th century a tax on knowledge, because for every newspaper published, there was a stamp tax that had led to a surcharge, obviously, on the cost of the newspaper. By 1855, all Stamp Acts are finally repealed, and this led to an enormous proliferation of the newspaper press, and particularly the provincial press. Now, the last thing I wanted to say about this image is that you can see that one of the key things about the public libraries is that they created new types of behavior internally. Okay, so you all know, because you all spend, I hope, many hours in the library, that there are certain rules to conduct in the library. One is meant to have one's cell phone turned off. One is meant to generally not be talking. It's meant to be, there's a very clear principle of organization of all the knowledge in there so that you can find anything that you want. And this was introduced by the Dewey system, obviously created by the American Melville Dewey in 1876. But basically, libraries were like sacred spaces that one moved quietly and efficiently and rationally within. That was the suitable environment for the acquisition of knowledge. So any questions before we move on to the new forms of commercial culture? Yeah, and your name, sorry. Right, from the, well, really from the 1830s, but there's a series of new types of religious practice or spiritualist practice, and you can see that in the middle of the 19th century with occultism, the fascination with occultism. You can see it in the practice of mesmerism, the fascination with how people become, how people could inhabit a mesmerized state and what that meant. And you can see it in the late 19th century with new, very small groups of spiritualists who become fascinated by trying to literally, scientifically study the soul or the spirit and the communication between the material world and the spiritual world. And there's a whole range of different types of practice that were associated with that I don't have time to get into. Any other questions? Great. I have lots of audio-visual things to show you today, so this is going to be the first multimedia lecture, so I'll awaken you later with some clips. I want, though, to move on to the new times and the new spaces of leisure that begin to develop. And so first, the thing about time. So the old customary culture was based around a different type of time regime. That is to say, and this is obviously a caricature because people had timepieces in the 17th and 18th century, they were just very rare and not hugely efficient. But generally, for the most of the working poor, the regulation of time was by daylight and by church bells. And so one big thing that historians are very fascinated by is how is it that we get a sort of modern form of standardized time, because clearly church bells and the sun varied enormously from locality to locality. Now, as I said, part of this process of a new time discipline came from the commercial proliferation of timepieces that became very fashionable in the 18th century and especially. But in the 19th century, it's primarily associated with what became known as railway time, the coordination of timetables by railway companies, bearing in mind that there are a myriad different railway companies trying to coordinate timetables with other companies. And increasingly, that was done by way of telegraph systems that often ran alongside railway lines. So you could no longer have a separate time, as is evident. This is the clock from Bristol Town Hall that had two minute hands. The black hand was Bristol time, which, as you can see, was about 10 minutes behind railway time. Now, very few places actually had these two different minute hands, but it serves to illustrate my purpose. So that was the first thing, the commercialization and the spread of railways. The second was, of course, the new time disciplines of industrial production and of industrial capitalism generally. So the new forms of mills and factories that developed in the late 18th and 19th centuries had very specific times in which people had to clock in and clock out of work. The factory gates opened and closed at very specific times. Mills in the industrial Northwest even employed what was known as a knocker-upper. That's not someone who goes to procreate with anyone that they can find. It's someone who goes around with a great long stick, knocking on the top windows of people's houses to make sure that they're awake and they'll get to work on time. And obviously also those mills and factories had their own specific ways of factory whistles or bells, or increasingly hooters by the late 19th century, to tell workers when their time was to knock off or to have a break, etc., etc. So new types of time discipline came in with new forms of work. And then finally, the third pressure here was the state. The attempt to create a nationally uniform time system. And that begins to happen in the 1870s and 1880s. So in the 1870s, you have the Factory Acts and the Bank Holiday Act of 1871 that established a 5.5-day working week from Monday to Saturday lunchtime, 105 hours in that working week, and uniform national holidays. The bank holidays in England are like federal holidays, basically, federally prescribed holidays. And then in 1880 came my favorite piece of legislation ever, the Definition of Time Act. The Definition of Time Act, which created a uniform time system across the entire country and paved the way for the standardization of international time, which of course became centered upon Greenwich in London. Greenwich Mean Time being south of the river in London, and that system of international standardization again was made possible by the transmission of through the telegraph system, the rapidly expanding telegraph system. So the point is that I'm trying to make here is not that time gets changed in lots of complex ways, although it does. It is that there is an increasingly clear separation of when people should be working and when people should be recreating themselves through leisure. So basically, Saturday afternoon was the beginning of rest time. People would go to the market, women would go to the market to buy food, and men would go to the pub or to any number of sporting activities to watch. And then Sunday would be the day for rest and recuperation and for sort of family time, so that people were ready for work bright and early on Monday. But there are two things that complicate this story of standardization. And the first is the practice of St. Monday, which is in many places and many trades had a special customary working week that meant that Monday was their day of rest, that their day of rest would be spread over Sunday and Monday. And it was called St. Monday, and St. Monday actually continued in some areas really quite late. So the Sheffield steel industry, for instance, through to the 1870s, continued to practice letting their workers have Monday off. The other exception is the practice of Wakes weeks. Hang on, just let me say that. Wakes weeks were linked to the local saint day of the parish church. Okay? And on the saint day that the parish church was named after, it was the custom that that parish would have a whole week off work. Okay? And very interestingly, this pattern of Wakes weeks continued to be incorporated into the calendars of many mills in industrial villages and towns. And that meant that different towns and villages had different weeks off across the year, mainly between May and September. Now, someone had a question. Yeah. No, there's no paid holiday at all until the 1930s. And I'll come on to that later. Here we have a great image produced by actually a contemporary artist, Bernard McMullen, called Wakes Week in a Northern Town. And you can see here people coming out of the steel working factories and the local fair being practiced in this way. It's done. This painting is done in the style of L.S. Lowry, who became hugely popular in Britain in the 1950s, and produced these these striking images of people overwhelmed by their industrial environments. The other thing about Wakes Weeks, which was really important, is that particularly in the industrial Northwest, people would go off to the seaside increasingly on paid excursions by their employer. Their employer would often provide a train to take their workers en masse to a seaside town, which in the Northwest was predominantly Blackpool. There were lots of others spread around the country. This produced a great trade in postcards like this one, which you can see is this mill hand transformed from her working environment, a Lancashire cotton mill, to the promenade on Blackpool, and the caption is, "Oh, what a difference." And I'm going to translate the dialect, the local dialect here. "Don't forget your old pals, see you on Monday, eh?" So just a classic reminder that you might be on holiday, but you haven't escaped the trials and tribulations of a working person. And one quick piece of footage.
When Mitchell and Kenyon and the showmen turned to film many of the factory gate exits in 1900 and 1901, they were usually met by a positive response from the audience and also from the factory owners. When they actually came to Rawmarsh to film Parkgate Iron and Steel Company, Rotherham, 1901, the reaction is not seen to be quite so popular by the local workforce. This would have been filmed on behalf of a fairground exhibitor to be shown at Rotherham Status, the local Wakes Fair, held in November every year, a charter fair known locally as the Status.
So you get the point here. This is one of the very, very early films, which very excitingly for nerds like me was discovered only about 5 years ago in the basement of some shop. And these films were shot when people came out of the working gates. And the idea was that then they would show them in a hall, and people would go to see themselves on film during the Wakes Week, and again to remind themselves of the fact that they weren't working, and that they, to see themselves represented on film for the first time. A very exciting event for many people, and more of these images later. Let me move on though, if you'll let me race through so I can have time to show you some more clips of the new spaces of leisure. Now, there could be any number of things that I could talk to you about here. I could talk to you about the development of commercialized shopping areas. I think we spoke about that new department stores in London's West End last week. I could talk to you about the new seaside resorts and the development of them, places like Blackpool. But the really classic one that I want to talk to you about is the music hall. And that's what I'm going to just focus upon here. Now, the music hall emerges from pubs. It emerges from people basically providing musical entertainments and sort of variety shows in pub settings like this one here. And they really, this is an image of I forget the name of the pub, that's bad of me, but anyway, it's from the 1860s. Increasingly in the 1870s and 1880s, you have the development of commercialized chains of music halls owned by, a company that would put on, would build a series of music halls in different places, like this one here, which again, I've naughtily forgotten where it is, but it was built in the 1890s. So it was extracted from the pub, this type of entertainment, from the pub into, and now its own discrete setting. In 1870, there were 31 large music halls in London and about 384 across the rest of the country. And you get the point is if you take them out of the pub and put them into purpose-built halls, you can charge admission prices for people in ways that you can't when shows are being put on in a pub. The sort of golden age of the music hall then is the 1880s, from the 1880s through to the First World War. And music halls become so respectable, they actually have their first Royal Command performance in 1912. What these purpose-built halls by these new chains, and some of the did, was to provide an increased capacity of audience so that they would generate more revenue. That enabled them to provide larger programs, a sort of a larger variety bill. They had melodramas, they had comedies, they had songs, and it enabled the owners of these chains to develop a star system, rather like the early Hollywood film industry, where they would propagate their own stars and then have them travel around their chains. I'll give you one quick clip to demonstrate to you. This is from a film in the 1930s by two big music hall stars of before the First World War, Nellie Wallace and Lily Morris. Hopefully this will work.
Why do silly folks wish other folks good morning, when the morning's always sure to be bad? If your head's like lead and you keep yawning, is it likely that you're going to be glad? A morning in the NVG is always full of sorrow, and what is worse, there's going to be another one tomorrow. What's the use? What's the sense? We don't mean no offense, but we won't say good morning anymore. What a hope! What a shout!
Okay, I think we've probably had enough of that. Both of these music hall stars made the transition into cinema. Clearly, this is from a film in 1935. Both of them were famous for representing working class life. This is a skit called The Char Ladies, i.e. domestic cleaners. And one of the big things about the music hall is that performers actually showed working class life back to their working class audiences. It was a type of entertainment that seemed to many people to be believable because it was closer to their experience. And both of these women actually were famous for playing the part of comedy parts of a sort of frustrated single woman. So Lily Morris' big hit, for instance, was "Why Am I Always the Bridesmaid?" You know. So here is something that speaks directly to the experience of young women at that time. Not that all young women in Britain were single and frustrated, clearly, because British men are not like that at all. The other point that I want to make about the music hall is that it creates a new type of discipline internally to the audience. And so I've given you three images here to give you some sense of the way in which the new type of dynamic of audience participation or spectatorship begins to develop. So in the first image, in the top left-hand corner, you have a rather unclear division within the audience around tables. The audience being as much part of the show as the actual stage. That would have been very characteristic of the pub environment. Here you have an early hall from the 1870s where you can see that the audience is beginning to look a little like a temperance hall. That you have a regularity of seats rather as in this lecture hall, and as in this lecture hall, all the seats are facing the stage. And that meant that the owners of music halls could begin to charge differential prices for where you sat. And so the audience began to be demarcated in terms of their social and economic positions. These halls also increasingly struggled with licensing laws. The London County Council in the 1880s began to the London County Council was created in the 1880s, and it immediately had a very strong representation of people that supported the temperance movement. and there was an attempt to try and get to stop these music halls from having liquor licenses. So one of the big London chains, Stoll's Music Halls, that's S-T-O-L-L, had in 1909 only 8 of their 29 music halls had liquor licenses. And again, this was an attempt to try and make the audience a little more focused on the entertainments and not their own pleasures. But, as you know from reading Thomas Wright's Among the Gods for this week, there are these seats up in the balconies, or right at the very, very top, known as the gods, where there were no seats and where working people could get in very free, including children. Not free, but get in very cheaply, including children. And if you read Thomas Wright's Among the Gods, you'll get a great sense of the way in which that part of the music hall provided their own types of entertainment, and very importantly, continue to have a critical dialogue with the performers, heckling them, throwing stuff at them, throwing stuff on the polite people on the polite seats down below, and generally continuing to be quite a disruptive presence. Did any of you read Thomas Wright, The Among the Gods? Yeah? So, Oliver, what was the thing that struck you about Among the Gods? Right, yeah, absolutely. Poor lad had his shoes stolen, had to walk home. And therefore his parents knew he'd sneaked into the music hall when he shouldn't have done. A bad experience. It's a great reading. You'll enjoy it. Okay, so let's move on because I'm desperate to talk about football, as in the proper type of football, not the thing that Americans think of as that sport. So the one example I'm going to give about the new a new type of mass culture is organized sport. And the reason why I want to do that is because I want to show you the way in which these new types of entertainment become increasingly organized and institutionalized. Now, the game of soccer has a... I'm sorry, you see I just became American. But bear with me. My American self is now going to talk about soccer dear. Okay. So the game of soccer had a long and complicated history in Britain that stretched back a while of people, chasing round balls over many fields, organised often between two villages. But it begins to become organised, ironically, in private schools, as does the game of rugby football, which is actually in many ways much closer to American football than to soccer. And sport becomes seen increasingly in the mid-19th century as a way of creating, in these private schools, new muscular Christian gentlemen. This was the philosophy of Thomas Arnold, the founder of the private school at Rugby in the 1860s, that became hugely influential across the private sector, that grew very dramatically in the last quarter of the 19th century. And the key thing about sport and muscular Christianity for these people was that it taught men discipline. It taught men discipline of observing the rules of the game, and it taught men teamwork, that the individual was part of a collective team effort, and that these were things that one learnt as amateurs, not as professionals. The amateur ideal was key. Only amateurs playing these games could truly be gentlemen. Professionalization was a bad thing. You had to play these games for the love of them, not for money. And you can see very quickly in the late 19th century, you get the development of standardized rules and professional organizations that try and create a standard game that was true across the country and then increasingly across the British Empire. So the Football Association was founded in 1880. The Rugby Football Union was founded in 1871. The MCC, which is the big cricket organisation, which had actually been around for a while but had a new set of rules developed in 1873. And then the Lawn Tennis Association, whose headquarters are obviously at Wimbledon, in 1888. Now, these organisations, these national organisations, create standard rules across the country and have organised competitions that teams or players across the country can participate in. And it isn't an accident that in soccer teams, and indeed in some rugby teams, emerged out of either school organisations or in soccer teams out of works organisations. So if any of you are fans of Arsenal, for instance, who are playing Bayern Munich, in fact the kickoff is probably in about 20 minutes in the Champions League. If any of you are interested, someone can tell me the score but at the end of the lecture, is the Arsenal team emerged out of the big munitions factory at the Royal Arsenal Woolwich factory in 1886. I'm not sure that I have time to show you this, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is a game between Sheffield United and Bury, again from these Mitchell and Kenyon films in 1902. And the thing that I want to show you...
This film is one of the most stunning in terms of quality in the entire Mitchell and Kenyon collection. It opens with a magnificent 1-minute pan shot of the crowd at Bramall Lane, where a sea of faces stare back towards the camera. No woman's present in the crowd, possibly as this was the standing area. The scene conjures up J.B. Priestley's description of the terraces as a place where you became a member of a new community, all brothers together for an hour and a half. Sheffield United were one of the leading teams in the First Division, and the action on the pitch features them in the Stripes versus Bury.
Okay, so you don't want to watch the game, which you don't really get to see a whole lot of anyway, because there's only like 2 cameras on the pitch. The point that I want to make here is that, again, the Mitchell and Kenyon technique is to show lots of images of the fans watching the game, in part because it means that people will go and watch the newsreel shown in the local hall later on, that maybe the next day or a couple of days later, in order to try and spot themselves in the audience. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is that the audience, as in a music hall, is a key component of the game as a whole. Okay, it's predominantly male, and it's very, very close to the pitch. You'll also see, if I carried on playing this, that there's a lot of advertising hoardings spread all around the game. So this, again, the game begins to be commercialized in terms of sponsored, of advertising and sponsorship. Even though the fans are a key part of the game and are incorporated into the reporting of it in ways that doesn't really happen anymore, where the focus is much more on the game and the players. What I'm suggesting to you is that here again you can see this new culture of spectatorship. People are now not necessarily playing football, they're going to watch it and pay to watch it commercially and to take their place in the audience as spectators, just as they did in the musical. Okay, so the last point that I wanted to make about this transformation of popular culture is of the importance of the empire and of immigrant cultures on national popular culture. But before I do that, I wanted to emphasize one thing, which is that I don't want you to come out of this lecture thinking, oh, by 1914, Britain has a national mass popular culture. Okay? Local differences continue to be hugely important in Britain. And one of the best illustrations of that is the persistence of local dialects and of local accents. Almost all Americans who travel around the UK are struck by how people sound very different in different regions of the country. For a very small island, it has an enormous degree of linguistic diversity. And that linguistic diversity doesn't simply get flattened out. It's often assumed that after the introduction of national education in the 1870s and 1880s, local dialects appear to decay. That's not the case. We know, for instance, from the early sound recordings of politicians in the 20th century, that politicians spoke with a whole range of different types of accents. And that continued to be the case really until quite late into the 20th century. It's also the case that local dialects, as you saw in that postcard, are often transcribed into print culture. So in fact, there's even a new genre of dialect poetry that becomes very big in the 1870s and 1880s. So national education and national print culture and a national popular culture doesn't flatten out necessarily all local differences. Nonetheless, popular culture in Britain does also become increasingly imperial in form and scope. Increasingly, the empire becomes incorporated into popular culture. It does that partly because of the absolute prevalence of imperial goods that people bought, as in this brand of Empire Tea, the marking of Empire Tea that you see behind me, but also in the creation of new types of holidays, as in the creation of a new public holiday called Empire Day in May 1896. Also in terms of the celebration of big imperial victories, of wars that were won, etc., etc. Also, a key factor of this is the increasing militarism of popular culture, and we'll see this in a couple of weeks when I talk about the new organizations like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides. The last thing I wanted to say is that you can also see the presence of empire in the increasing presence of new immigrant communities in Britain itself, particularly with the presence of the Irish. The Irish leave a hugely important impact on British popular culture. A lot of the romantic songs of music hall were Irish. And you can also see it in the celebration of national holidays, like this one I'm about to show you, of the Lady Godiva procession to celebrate the coronation of King Edward VII. This is really funky. And there's no sound. There she is, Lady Godiva, half naked on horseback. And then you're going to see the procession through the town. And the point that I want you to get, if this image ever moves on, is look at the performance of cultural difference by different elements in the procession, basically representing different parts of Britain's imperial encounter. Oh, it's very grainy, isn't it? You can't actually see anything up there. This is a procession that restages British history and has a whole series of floats and sections from South Africa, from India, from East Africa, and so forth, including, and I don't have time to show you, including a bunch of locals all done up in blackface to represent some group of colonial subjects. This is the Crusades, look, coming through here. Splendid stuff. Okay. But you really can't see it. Okay, so let me wrap up. Does anyone have any questions before I stun you with some final concluding thoughts? Yes. I love the Joy Division t-shirt. When did football chants start? Football chants started, absolutely at this time. We don't have any recordings of football chants until much, much later, obviously, because there's no sound recording. But it's evident from the news reporting of football games that there are chants that develop. There's an absolutely fantastic app, by the way, that you can get called Football Chants, which I highly, if there are any soccer fans out there, if you want to get the creativity of football fans and their songs, download this app and you'll see the way in which their chants literally change from game to game and season to season. And they're very, very satirical and sometimes deeply unpleasant about their own players or managers, or and certainly those of their rivals. One of the key things I didn't say about soccer, of course, is that a lot of it was based upon confessional rivalries or ethnic rivalries. So Liverpool and Everton, both from the city of Liverpool. Everton is the Protestant team, Liverpool is the Catholic team. The same is true of Manchester United and Manchester City. The same is true of Glasgow Rangers and Celtic. Okay, these religious differences were very, very profound and marked, and that's why there was a deep history of violence between those supporters of those teams. But my very first night in Manchester as an undergraduate student, I went out to the pub because I was over 18. There'd been a game that day, I think, between City and United, and someone came up to me and said, "Are you a red or are you a blue?" It's like a 50-50 chance. You get it wrong, you're going to get beaten up. So I didn't answer, I just ran. Okay, so the old disorderly nature of British popular culture hasn't been entirely cleansed, despite the forms of moral and rational reform that it has been subjected to for now 2 centuries. So just to very briefly recap, what I've been suggesting to you today is that it's in this period, and particularly in the second half of the 19th century, that we see something that looks to us as a modern form of popular culture. The forms of that culture look distinctly modern. It has the institutions, the organizational basis, it has the commercial basis, and it has the clear place in terms of the distinction between work and recreation. But and it has these new spaces that are designed for its propagation and conduct. But what I've also been trying to suggest to you is that that process of reform, as in with all the processes of reform that I've been talking about these last few lectures, was very gradual and uneven. That there was a good deal of continuity from that old customary culture, even as it was being busily reformed by moral and rational reformers. And that these things that we now take for granted, like you can't have like at the moment, one of the big things that's going on in Britain is the FA Cup, the Football Association Cup, which is the world's oldest knockout cup competition. All of these new types of traditions, the final is always started with a rendition of the national anthem. All of these new traditions were basically a product of this period of time. The last point I've been trying to make to you is that I want you to be very clear that these new forms of popular culture were not simply about fun and entertainment. They had to be, in important ways, in order for people to make money out of them. Okay? the commercial imperative would not have worked had people not wanted to consume these new forms of popular culture. But those new forms of popular culture taught people how to recreate themselves in new ways. And I've emphasized, importantly, the emphasis upon rational forms of recreation, of how to become a rational and moral person of good character. But I've also emphasized that many of the new forms of mass popular culture were grounded in a new, with a new emphasis upon people as spectators rather than participants or agents or makers of their own recreational pursuits. And that is, of course, the great legacy that continues to live with us to this day. Okay, thank you very much. See you on Thursday.